Sign the papers, Christabel, or your daughter never leaves this house alive. My mother's scream shattered the sanctuary of my home, her eyes wide with a manic greed that turned her into a monster. She held a video feed of my child, my John Bonet, trembling under a kidnapper's needle, a sick ransom for a sister who had already bled me dry. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I simply leaned in, let out a chilling, radiant smile, and signed my own erasure with a broken pen. They thought they had harvested me like a prize crop, but as I stood up, I knew the countdown to their funeral had already begun. The memory of her screeching voice still claws at my throat, a phantom burn that won't fade even as the reality of the road ahead takes over. The Manhattan lights faded into an amber hue, giving way to the bare, gnarled oak trees of the Gold Coast. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching the innocent, sleepy eyes of my 5-year-old daughter, John Bonet. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, completely unaware that the $5 million estate we were approaching, a property with neatly trimmed hedges and heated cobblestone streets, was a monument to my own exhaustion. I had spent 10 years as a senior partner at a top law firm, working 80 hours a week until my eyes ached, just to ensure Gertrude and Fritz lived in the comfort they deserved. I've always believed that wealth is merely a tool, and family is the hand that should guide it. But as the iron gates of the estate swung open, the heavy clatter felt less like a welcome and more like a lock clicking into place. I pulled into the circle, the engine's hum dying out to leave a silence so profound it felt predatory. I reached back and squeezed John Bonet's hand, a silent promise between us. We were here for a celebration, a milestone of parents who had reached their golden years on the back of my labor. I told myself that family isn't about the debt you owe the past, but the love you build for the future. Yet, as I stepped out into the biting wind, the familiar scent of wood smoke didn't feel cozy. It felt like a warning. The front door opened before I could reach for the brass knocker. My mother, Gertrude, stood there with a smile so bright it looked brittle, like glass about to shatter. Fritz was right behind her, his posture rigid, his eyes darting toward my car rather than my face. They ushered us in with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed, a sharp contrast to the cold indifference I usually received. In the living room, my older sister, Casey, was already lounging by the fire. She held a crystal glass of Cabernet, the $100 a bottle vintage I had delivered by the case, and barely looked up. Her eyes had a smug, knowing glint that made the hair on my arms stand up. The fire was roaring, sending waves of heat through the room, but the air felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the space by an invisible force. I gave Gertrude the designer silk scarf I had brought with me, and Fritz the rare antique watch I had hunted down at an auction. I wanted to believe in warmth. I wanted to think that after 10 years of being their ATM, they had finally seen me, their daughter, the pillar of the family. Wealth only has meaning when it serves those who raised us, I said, handing out the gifts with absolute sincerity. Fritz nodded slightly in thanks, but his hand trembled as he placed the watch on the shelf. I caught Casey's gaze over my wineglass. She was grinning, a small, ugly smirk. I felt the first knot of tension tighten in my stomach. Silence is a barrier to intellect, but in this house, it always served to conceal a trap. Dinner was a grand affair, but I couldn't taste the roast. The conversation was a shallow stream of pleasantries that Gertrude navigated with terrifying precision. Then, as the plates were cleared, the mood shifted. The warmth in the room evaporated, replaced by a clinical, courtroom chill. Gertrude didn't bring out dessert. Instead, she placed a heavy, leather-bound book on the white linen tablecloth. She called it a memory album, a celebration of my 10 years of professional success. I felt a fleeting moment of hope, thinking they had finally acknowledged my hard work. I opened the cover, expecting to see family photos or perhaps clippings of my major case, wins. The first page wasn't a photo. It was a high-resolution surveillance image of me entering a private client meeting in Midtown 3 years ago. I flipped the page, bank statements, tax returns, photos of John Bonet being dropped off at her private preschool. There were logs of my travel, GPS coordinates of my weekend trips, and even transcripts of private conversations I'd had with my financial advisors. My heart plummeted. This wasn't a tribute, it was a dossier. My own parents had been monitoring me, tracking my movements and my wealth like hunters stalking a prize buck. Gertrude's voice, once honeyed, turned to ice. "We had to ensure the family's interests were protected, Christabel," she said, her eyes dead and fixed on mine. "You've been very successful. Too successful to be trusted to manage it all alone." I realized in that heartbeat that they didn't see a daughter at the table. They saw a portfolio they were waiting to liquidate. A person's value is not determined by those who fail to see it, I thought, my lawyer's brain kicking into gear even as my heart fractured. I set my fork down with a precise metallic click. I didn't scream. I didn't demand an explanation. I sat perfectly still, observing the enemy's cards while keeping my own hidden beneath the table. The betrayal was so absolute it was almost absurd. Casey leaned forward then, her voice dripping with fake concern. She talked about her investments, the illegal offshore trading that had actually wiped out her savings and left her in debt to people who didn't use lawyers to collect. They believed it was my legal and moral obligation to rebalance the family scales. To them, my hard work was just a communal pool for Casey's failures. The escalation happened with a speed that left me breathless. Gertrude stood up and signaled to a woman I'd never seen before. A new nanny, she claimed, who took John Bonet by the hand. "Let's get the little one upstairs for her nap," Gertrude said, her voice a jagged command. I tried to stand, my maternal instincts screaming, but Fritz's hand came down on my shoulder. It was cold and firm, a physical weight that anchored me to the chair. The transition from the family home to a hostage situation was completed in the time it took for the door to click shut behind my daughter. I looked at the heavy oak doors of the library. They were closed, and I heard the unmistakable thud of a deadbolt sliding home. I forced myself to breathe, the air tasting of old paper and malice. "Love that demands a price isn't love, Mother," I said, my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. "It's a transaction, and I stopped being a commodity a long time ago." Fritz didn't flinch. He produced a stack of documents from a hidden drawer, irrevocable transfer agreements for my primary LLC and the deed to my Manhattan penthouse. He told me that in the eyes of this family, I was merely the manager of a fortune that belonged to the name, not the individual. They were stripping me of everything I had built, using my own child as the lever. I reached for my phone in my pocket, my fingers brushing the screen to call my husband, Lyle. I looked down at the display, expecting to see the comforting bars of my service provider. Instead, I watched as the signal bars vanished one by one, replaced by a hollow, no-service icon. I glanced at the corners of the room, spotting the small, blinking lights of a signal jammer. I looked toward the window. The snow was a white wall, the gates were locked, and the house was a dead zone. Gertrude leaned across the table, her smile predatory and wide, showing far too many teeth. The digital world died with a soft, final chirp from my wrist. I instinctively lifted my left arm, the familiar weight of my smartwatch feeling suddenly like a lead shackle. The screen flickered, searching for a ghost of a signal before settling into a flat, gray, no-service icon. I had spent my entire adult life navigating the high-frequency chaos of Manhattan, where a lost connection was a mere inconvenience. Here, in the suffocating silence of my parents' Greenwich library, it felt like being buried alive in silk and mahogany. My father, Fritz, didn't move from the doorway. He reached out, his hand steady and devoid of the warmth I had remembered from my childhood, and slid the manual brass deadbolt into place. The sound was a definitive metallic thud that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't just a door closing. It was the final seal on a domestic siege. They hadn't invited Christabel home for a family dinner. They had lured a high-value target into a kill box. The library was lit only by the dying embers of the fireplace and two dim Tiffany lamps that cast long, distorted shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and copper filling my lungs. I refused to let my hands tremble. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my panic. I remembered a truth I often whispered to junior associates at the firm. A calm mind is the ultimate weapon against an irrational storm. I adjusted my posture, sitting back into the velvet armchair to project an authority I had worked a decade to earn. If they wanted to play a game of power, They were forgetting that I was the one who had mastered the rules in the most cutthroat boardrooms in the country. The door creaked open just enough for Casey to slip through. She carried a silver tray with a porcelain teapot and 2 cups, her eyes fixed firmly on the floral rug. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. I watched her hands shake as she set the tray on the low table between Gertrude and me. Looking at her, I saw the true weight of the catastrophe. For a family of this stature to resort to commercial-grade cell jammers, a blatant violation of federal law, Casey's debts had to be more than just embarrassing. They were ruinous. My sister had gambled with shadows, and now my parents were trying to pay the tab with my life's work. Casey scurried back toward the kitchen like a ghost, leaving me alone with the architects of my erasure. Gertrude broke the silence. She leaned forward, the flickering firelight catching the predatory glint in her eyes. Without a word, she slid a thick legal folder across the table toward me. I didn't reach for it immediately. I let it sit there, a physical manifestation of their betrayal. I knew what was inside before I even flipped the cover. A grant deed for my Manhattan penthouse and a membership interest transfer agreement for my primary business LLC. They weren't just asking for a loan, they were demanding a total surrender. Gertrude spoke with a chilling pragmatism, her voice devoid of maternal softness. She claimed that because I was independent, because I was childless in the eyes of their traditional greed, ignoring the very existence of my daughter's future, it was my burden to save Casey from public shame. "You have so much, Christabel," Gertrude whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "Casey has nothing. It's only fair that you rebalance the scales." I looked at the documents, the cold black ink of the signature lines staring back at me like an open grave. "If you are in trouble, Mother, you only had to ask," I said, my voice steady and low. "If the family is drowning, I would have been the first to jump in. But ask me like a mother, not a captor. Money is just paper, but the bond we are breaking tonight should have been iron." I was offering her a bridge, a way back from the ledge. I wanted to see if there was a single shred of the woman who had once read me bedtime stories left inside that hollowed-out shell of avarice. Gertrude didn't even blink. She let out a short, dry scoff that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Pity," she spat. "I don't want your charity. I want what is rightfully the family's. You used our name to build that empire. Now, that empire will save our name." In that moment, the final veil fell away. I understood Gertrude's world perfectly. Love was a zero-sum game. For one person to have it, another had to lose it. For Casey to survive, Christabel had to be harvested. The air in the room grew colder. I looked toward the door where Fritz remained a silent sentinel. "Where is John Benet?" I asked, my voice sharpening. "I want to see my daughter." Fritz didn't turn around. His voice was a flat rasp. "She's safe, Christabel. She's sleeping, and she'll stay safe as long as the ink flows." The threat wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream in the silence. The stakes had shifted from the financial to the existential in a single sentence. My daughter was no longer a grandchild in this house. She was collateral. I felt a surge of white-hot protective fury, but I clamped it down. If I broke now, we both lost. I needed to be the lawyer. I needed to be the strategist. I looked at the cell jammer tucked behind a bust of Virgil. I recognized the brand, a high-end model Lyle had warned me about during his security briefings. These devices had a specific, rhythmic pulse to their interference. I shifted my hand, letting my heavy sapphire ring click against the mahogany table. Tap, 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 tap. I began a slow, rhythmic pattern, a silent SOS coded into the cadence of my movements. I hoped, with a desperation I couldn't show, that Lyle's security sensors in the SUV were picking up the unique electronic noise of the jammer, and that he was already decoding my signal. I needed time. I needed them to believe I was considering their ultimatum. "You want me to sign away a decade of my life?" I asked, looking from the folder to Gertrude. "Then give me the respect of a full explanation. I want to see the debt notes. I want to see exactly who Casey is hiding from. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." I was stalling, every word a calculated move to keep them talking, to keep the light of my presence in this room until Lyle could find a way through the white wall of snow outside. Gertrude stood up, her patience finally fraying. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek remote. "You want to see, Christabel? Fine. Let's see how much your pride is worth." She pressed a button, and the large monitor on the library wall, usually reserved for stock tickers and news, flickered to life. The image was grainy, black and white, and slightly distorted, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a small child, huddled in the corner of a darkened room I didn't recognize. JonBenet. She looked small, vulnerable, and utterly alone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. The fire in the hearth was gasping for its last breath, sending jagged obsidian shadows dancing across the library walls, like ghosts of a childhood I no longer recognized. My breath hitched as Gertrude's fingernails dug into my forearm, her grip like iron claws, forcing me to keep my eyes on the grainy monitor. The man's hand on the screen, large, calloused, and indifferent, lingered just inches from JonBenet's small shoulder. The threat wasn't just visual anymore. It was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, threatening to crush the very air from my lungs. I sat there, paralyzed by the sight of my own mother using my child as a bargaining chip in a high-stakes transaction of greed. Gertrude began a systematic deconstruction of my life, her voice a low, rhythmic hum of calculated malice. She spoke about Casey, the golden child, and how she had supposedly sacrificed her youth to stay in this house while I selfishly chased a legal career in the concrete canyons of Manhattan. It was a distorted narrative, a poison-tipped arrow aimed at the guilt she thought I still carried. She argued that my assets, every dollar I had bled for, every late night I had sacrificed, were actually family property. In her mind, the education I worked 3 jobs to put myself through was a debt I could never fully repay. I listened as she retitled my success as theft from the family collective, a common tactic in the dark underbelly of toxic inheritance disputes. I kept my face a mask of cold porcelain, refusing to be lured into the emotional trap of a shouting match. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust and the copper of my own silent rage. "Gratitude is a flower that blooms in freedom, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through her monologue like a scalpel. "It is not a debt to be collected at the point of a knife." I looked at her then, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't see the woman who had tucked me in or wiped my scraped knees. I saw a stranger, a woman so hollowed out by her obsession with Casey's survival that she had become a predator. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the rot beneath the silk and the Greenwich prestige. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of the betrayal. I stood up, my maternal instincts overriding the fear, intending to walk through Fritz and find my daughter by any means necessary. Without a flicker of warning, Gertrude lunged forward. The crack of her palm against my cheek echoed through the silent library like a gunshot. The physical shock sent a jolt of electricity through my nerves, and for a second, the room blurred. I felt the sharp sting of her ring cutting into my skin, but I didn't fall. I stood my ground, my head tilted to the side, the silence that followed more deafening than the blow itself. "You ungrateful brat!" Gertrude screamed, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. "You owe your very existence to this family. You think you're so smart with your degrees and your firm? You're nothing but a tool for us." She leaned in, her breath hot against my ear. "JonBenet's safety is the only collateral left for the debts Casey can't pay. If you don't sign, I will make sure you both spend the rest of your lives regretting it." The malice was raw and naked now, stripped of the family-first veneer they usually wore like a protective suit. Despite the fire burning on my cheek, I didn't feel the urge to strike back. A profound, icy sadness washed over me instead. I looked Gertrude in her eyes, seeing the desperation of a woman who had lost her soul to protect a failure. "You haven't just taken my peace tonight," I whispered, my voice steady and filled with a terrifying calm. "You've destroyed the memory of the mother I thought I had. I can forgive your anger, but I cannot permit your cruelty to touch my child." In that moment, the power shifted. I realized her violence was the final gasp of a weak mind that had run out of arguments. I wasn't the victim here. I was the only adult left in the room. Fritz stepped out of the shadows, pushing the legal documents closer to me until they brushed against my hand. His voice was a low, threatening rumble. "Casey is facing dangerous people, Christabel. People who don't care about legalities or Greenwich manners. Your wealth is the only shield she has left. I realized then that my parents were perfectly willing to liquidate my entire life and put their granddaughter at existential risk just to provide another safety net for a sister who had never learned to walk on her own. They were asking for a contract of souls, a total erasure of my identity to fund Casey's reckless choices. I felt a spark of intellectual resilience flare up in the darkness of my mind. The strongest walls are not made of stone, Christabel, I reminded myself. They are made of the truth we hold within. I picked up the folder, my lawyer's brain beginning to dissect the language of the transfer agreements even as my heart grieved. I looked for the loopholes, the jurisdictional errors, the signs of a document prepared in haste and desperation. I needed to appear compliant, to give Lyle the time he needed to bridge the gap they had created with their digital silence. I was no longer just a daughter. I was a strategist playing for the highest stakes imaginable. Gertrude reached out and grabbed my jaw, her fingers digging into the bruise she had just created. She forced my head up, compelling me to look back at the monitor. The grainy black and white image flickered. The man on the screen moved closer to JonBenet, his hand reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, unidentifiable object, a syringe or a blade, and began to lower it toward her sleeping form. My breath hitched, a jagged sob catching in my throat as Gertrude's voice hissed in my ear, making the threat terrifyingly real. "One signature, Christabel," she whispered. "That's all it takes to keep her safe." The library had become a tomb, chilled not just by the draft from the snowstorm, but by the icy realization that my own flesh and blood had orchestrated this nightmare. Gertrude's fingernails were still digging into my skin, her breath a hot, sickly sweet contrast to the freezing terror in my veins. "One signature, Christabel," she hissed again, her voice a serrated blade. "That's all it takes to keep her safe." She forced my chin toward the wall-mounted monitor, and the world outside the Greenwich estate ceased to exist. The screen flickered with a grainy, high-contrast feed of an industrial playground I didn't immediately recognize. The metal of the swings looked rusted, skeletal against the gray night sky. There, huddled on a cracked plastic bench, was JonBenet. She looked so small, a tiny island of innocence in a sea of concrete and shadows. My biological response was a violent, internal earthquake. My lungs seized, the air turning to jagged glass as I watched a man in a dark hoodie loom over her. He wasn't touching her yet, but he held a syringe with a clinical, terrifying indifference. It was a silent, visual promise of a harm so profound it made my legal armor shatter into 1,000 useless pieces. Looking back, I should have seen the depths of Gertrude's depravity, but a mother's heart always hopes for a mercy that isn't there. "One phone call from me, and she's gone," Gertrude whispered, leaning in so close her pearls brushed my shoulder. "This isn't about property anymore, Christabel. This is about whether your daughter wakes up tomorrow." The sheer monstrous scale of the betrayal hit me then. My mother wasn't just stealing my money. She was harvesting my soul to fund Casey's failures. I felt a sob catch in my throat, a primal, animal sound of grief. But as I looked at JonBenet's brave, quiet face on that screen, I made a silent vow. "I will be your strength when you have none," I promised her across the digital void. I refused to let hatred consume me, even now. I looked at Gertrude and saw a soul so profoundly lost that it no longer recognized the light of its own grandchild. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds, a technique Lyle taught me for high-stakes negotiations. 1, 2, 3. I forced my heart rate to descend from the ceiling. Panic is a luxury I could no longer afford. "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," the philosopher said, and in that freezing library, JonBenet was my only why. My terror didn't vanish. It crystallized. It became a razor-sharp tactical focus. I opened my eyes and I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was a strategist. I began to dissect the live stream. I noticed the specific rusted angle of the slide and the way the fog drifted in from the left. Then, I heard it. The low, mournful groan of a distant foghorn. It was a sound I knew by heart. This wasn't a random warehouse. It was the old maritime park near the Greenwich docks. A place where Fritz used to take me to watch the ships when I was a girl. The irony was a bitter pill, but the information was a weapon. They were local. They were close. I turned my gaze to Fritz and Gertrude, my voice dropping into a calm, hollow register. "You think you are saving Casey," I said, my eyes moving between them with a clinical detachment. "But you are only teaching her that there are no consequences for failure. True compassion is helping someone grow through their mistakes, not robbing others to fund their destruction. You aren't saving a daughter. You are feeding a parasite." Fritz looked away, his jaw tight, but Gertrude only tightened her grip on my arm. She was too far gone to hear the truth. While Gertrude was mesmerized by her own cruel power, I subtly shifted my weight. I reached up, ostensibly to adjust the collar of my coat, and touched the small, emerald-encrusted brooch pinned to my lapel. It was a custom security piece Lyle had designed for my birthday. A high-gain microphone and transmitter disguised as a family heirloom. I needed Gertrude to keep talking. I needed her to confess the terms of the kidnapping so the audio-visual feed being relayed to Lyle's remote server would be legally bulletproof. "Tell me exactly what you want," I prompted, my voice sounding defeated and thin. "If I sign, what happens to my daughter?" Fritz stepped forward, slamming the thick stack of documents onto the mahogany desk. The sound was like a gavel bringing a trial to order. "You sign everything," he barked. "The LLC, the penthouse, the offshore accounts. You sign the voluntary surrender of assets, and you waive all rights to future claims. Do it now, or we stop the feed." Under U.S. law, a contract signed under such extreme duress is void, but I knew that in this room, legal theory was a dead language. Only survival mattered. I had to appear broken. I had to let them believe their psychological trap had snapped shut. "I will sign," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I let my shoulders slump, playing the role of the conquered woman. "Not because you have won. Not because I believe you deserve a single cent of what I've built. I will sign because my daughter's life is worth more than every dollar I will ever earn. Take the penthouse. Take the company. My wealth was never my identity, and you can't steal what you never understood." I reached for the vintage fountain pen, my knuckles white against the dark wood. I looked at Gertrude one last time, searching for a spark of regret, a glimmer of the mother who used to bake cookies on rainy Sundays. There was nothing but the cold, hard hunger of a predator. I realized then that the bridge between us wasn't just broken, it was officially burnt to ash. A bridge can be rebuilt with time and effort, I thought, but a soul sold for gold is lost to the current forever. I didn't hate her. I simply stopped recognizing her. As the nib of the pen touched the signature line of the irrevocable transfer agreement, my eyes flickered to the small emerald on my brooch. In the dim light of the library, I saw it, a tiny green LED light flashing twice in quick succession. It was the in-position signal. Lyle was close. The game was no longer about surrender. It was about the countdown. The air in the library had turned stagnant, heavy with the metallic scent of old books and the sharp, suffocating tang of ink. The pen in my hand felt like a lead weight, an anchor dragging me toward a surrender I had rehearsed in my mind but never truly felt in my bones until this moment. My mother's eyes were wide, hungry, reflecting the flickering embers of a fire that was nearly out of fuel. I looked at the signature line on the irrevocable transfer agreement, the space where I was supposed to sign away my identity, my daughter's future, and a decade of my life. My hand did not shake. Christabel had learned long ago that fear is a luxury for those who don't have everything to lose. I gripped the vintage fountain pen, the same one I had gifted Fritz for his 60th birthday, and pressed the nib to the vellum. I signed with a slow, deliberate cadence. As I reached the final loop of my name, I didn't stop. I applied a violent, downward pressure, feeling the gold nib snap against the mahogany desk with a sickening crack. A large, jagged blot of black ink exploded across the document, staining the wood in the legal jargon in a permanent, ugly Rorschach test of betrayal. I let the broken instrument roll away, a useless husk of a tool. I looked up at my parents, my voice coming out as a cool, steady stream of ice. "A pen can be replaced, Mother, but a bond, once snapped with this much force, remains nothing but a jagged memory." I saw Fritz flinch at the sight of the ink-stained mahogany, but I felt no regret. "I have given you the gold you crave. Now, I want to see if it has the power to buy back the daughter you've just lost." In the silence that followed, I understood a fundamental American truth I had once forgotten. Hard work is the foundation of character, but greed is the rot that consumes the entire house. I looked at them and felt a profound, hollow pity. They weren't victors, they were prisoners of their own avarice. I rose, smoothing the wrinkles on my designer coat with a cold, detached calm. The moment before had reached its limit, a cold, radiant energy flowing through my body. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, I looked Gertrude straight in the eyes and offered a gentle, radiant smile. The smile of a woman who had seen the end of the game while her opponent was still arguing about the first move. The change in atmosphere was palpable. I saw my mother's fierce gaze vanish, replaced by a sudden, creeping unease. The predators had just realized the cage door was open, and they were the ones trapped inside. "You taught me that a good lawyer always looks for the trap," I said, my voice echoing in the rafters. "But you forgot that I was the best student you ever had. I'm not leaving this room because I've lost everything, Gertrude. I'm leaving because I am finally free of the crushing weight of your expectations. You can have the penthouse, you can have the LLC, but you will never, ever have me again." I turned my gaze toward Casey, who was clutching her wine glass like a lifeline. I offered her a nod of cold, distant compassion. "I hope this money makes you happy, Casey. But remember, a cage made of gold is still a cage. You've just locked yourself in, and the key is at the bottom of a very deep well." The silence was shattered by Gertrude's sudden, frantic movement. Sensing the shift in power, she panicked. She fumbled with a side drawer and produced a folder filled with falsified financial records, shoddily constructed lies claiming I had been embezzling from the family accounts for years. "You think you're walking away!" she shrieked, her voice hitting a desperate, high-pitched note. "If you don't stay and manage these assets for Casey, if you don't do exactly as we say, I'll send these to the district attorney tomorrow. You'll lose your license, your reputation, and your freedom. You'll go to prison, Christabel." I didn't even flinch at the threat. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't need a lawyer, Mother. Only lies require such expensive, elaborate protection. I took a step toward the door, my movements fluid and untroubled. "Go ahead, file your report. I look forward to the discovery phase of the trial. I'm sure the FBI will be very interested in the chain of custody for those documents." I adjusted my brooch, and for the first time I let them see the steady, unwavering green light pulsing against the emerald. It was the digital heartbeat of their downfall. Fritz moved as if to grab my arm, a desperate, final attempt to reclaim control. I raised my hand, a gesture so commanding he stopped in his tracks. "Don't touch me, Fritz. The air in this room is already toxic enough." I looked at the heavy brass deadbolt on the door. "I have a date with the sunrise, and you have a date with the consequences of tonight. Some things, once broken, can never be made whole again." I had spent my life trying to be the good daughter, but I realized then that being good to people who are determined to be bad is just a form of slow-motion suicide. I walked toward the library door, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, a rhythmic, cinematic countdown. Fritz reached for the deadbolt, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold metal. But just as he touched the brass, a new sound began to permeate the walls. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, a deep vibration that began to rattle the crystal decanters on the side table. The floorboards beneath my feet began to hum with a mechanical fury coming from the driveway outside. I turned my back on the jagged ink stain on the desk, my smile widening as the vibration from the driveway grew into a roar that shook the very foundation of the Greenwich estate. The house was no longer a dead zone. The world was coming back, and it was bringing a storm of justice with it. Fritz stood paralyzed, his hand hovering near the brass deadbolt as if the mechanical thunder outside had turned his blood to lead. The signal jammer, that blinking little god they worshipped to isolate me, was now a useless piece of plastic. I reached up and adjusted my custom brooch, the emerald glinting under the dim library lights. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a satellite-linked lifeline that had been broadcasting every word, every threat, and every sickening demand to an offshore server for the last 4 hours. "You didn't isolate me, Gertrude," I said, looking at my mother with a calm, triumphant logic. While you were busy cutting off the cell towers, my device was using a low-frequency satellite uplink. Every second of this extortion, every threat against my daughter, is currently sitting on a federal prosecutor's desk. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her looking like a crumbling paper doll. Under the Hobbs Act, their little domestic siege had crossed into the territory of federal racketeering and extortion. I had provided them with a perfect acoustic environment for a confession they could never take back. They thought they were playing a game of checkers, unaware that I had been playing the board in 3 dimensions from the moment I stepped through the door. I felt a strange, quiet grace settle over me as I looked at the broken people who shared my DNA. I would have given you the world. Christabel would have moved mountains for you, if you had only asked with love, I whispered, the weight of the realization making my voice thick. But you chose to steal a handful of dust instead. You valued my bank account more than my heartbeat. My strength didn't come from the millions of dollars they just tried to seize. It came from the fact that I was still human, and they were merely hollowed-out shells of greed. I wasn't just a daughter they could harvest. I was a woman who knew her worth. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the hardwood with a cinematic finality. Fritz tried to move into my path, a feeble, desperate attempt to play the patriarch one last time. I didn't stop. I leaned in close, my eyes locking onto his. If you touch me, father, the charges move from extortion to kidnapping and assault. Choose your next second very wisely. The clock is ticking, and the world is watching. He recoiled as if I had struck him. I pushed the heavy oak door open, the brass deadbolt surrendering with a hollow metallic whine. I stepped out of the tomb and into the freezing night, the snow falling in thick, silent sheets that felt like a baptism of clarity. A black security SUV skidded to a halt in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin sabers. Lyle stepped out, his face a mask of tactical, unyielding focus. He didn't waste time with a greeting. He simply opened the passenger door, his hand steady and warm against mine as I climbed in. The release of tension was so violent it made my lungs ache. I sank into the leather seat, the hum of the engine a comforting rhythmic pulse after the stagnant silence of the library. Lyle looked at me, a world of unspoken protection in his gaze, before handing me a high-resolution tablet. "She's safe, Christabel," he said, his voice a low rumble. On the screen I saw John Bonet. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sleeping soundly in the back of a secure vehicle. My heart, which had been a wild bird in a cage of bone, finally found its nest. Lyle revealed the ultimate reversal. The kidnapper my mother had hired was actually a former military contractor Lyle had once saved from a ruinous legal battle. He had been Lyle's ghost inside their operation from the very beginning. Every threat made against my daughter was part of a sting operation designed to reveal the true extent of my family's malice. I leaned my head back against the headrest, a single hot tear of relief tracing a path down my cheek. "The good we do into world has a way of finding its way back home when the windows are dark," I murmured. Lyle's past act of kindness, a simple gesture of professional integrity years ago, had become the shield that protected our child tonight. It was a profound reminder that humanity is the only currency that never devalues. Through the tinted window of the SUV, I saw Casey's silhouette in the library. She was frantically shoving the ink-stained documents into the dying fire, unaware that under U.S. law, spoliation of evidence during a federal investigation only guarantees a longer prison sentence. I pulled my own phone out, the signal bars now standing tall and proud. My fingers flew across the screen with a rapid-fire legal precision. I executed a stop payment on every trust account that funded the Greenwich estate. I froze the corporate credit cards Casey had been bleeding dry for years. I was no longer the family's ATM. I was the one cutting the power. I drafted a formal cease and desist, attaching a snippet of the satellite recording, and sent it to my firm's senior partners. I was shielding my reputation, ensuring that Gertrude's planned smear campaign would die in the cradle. I was finally breathing for myself, the air in the SUV clean and filtered, free from the rot of Greenwich. As Lyle shifted the vehicle into gear and we began to pull away, I looked at the fading lights of the house I once considered home. To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. My family had spent their lives trying to cage me, but in doing so, they had only built their own prison. I was leaving the shadows behind, heading toward a Manhattan dawn that belonged only to me, Lyle, and John Bennett. I wasn't just surviving, I was reclaiming the narrative of my own life. The quiet of the car was broken by a sharp, high-priority chirp from Lyle's phone. He glanced at the console, a grim line tightening his jaw. "The Greenwich PD and the FBI just crossed the town line," he said, checking the tactical map. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 4:55 a.m. The time for negotiations was over. The time for the reckoning had arrived. The blue and red lights began to dance against the falling snow in the distance, a grim neon herald of the justice I had set in motion. At precisely 5 a.m., the suffocating silence of the Greenwich estate was shattered by the deafening roar of federal authority. A fleet of Greenwich PD and FBI vehicles swarmed the driveway, their sirens an overlapping wail that x-rayed the pre-dawn stillness. The silence protocol Gertrude had so carefully initiated, the cell jammers, the deadbolts, the psychological isolation, was now being dismantled by the cold, impartial hand of the law. I watched from the warmth of Lyle's SUV as agents poured into the house, their silhouettes sharp and purposeful against the pristine white snow. This was the dawn reckoning I'd engineered with the broken nib of a fountain pen and the steady pulse of a satellite brooch. Inside that library, the legal hammer fell with absolute finality. Federal agents secured the ink-stained documents I had left on the mahogany desk, the physical proof of a transaction born of malice. Under 18 U.S. Code Section 875 and Section 1201, Gertrude and Fritz weren't just parents having a family dispute. They were defendants facing charges of federal extortion and conspiracy to kidnap. They had tried to harvest my life's work by threatening my daughter, and in the eyes of the United States government, that was a debt no amount of Greenwich prestige could settle. Casey was found in the kitchen, her face a mask of hysterical panic as she tried to shove the transfer papers into the trash compactor. An agent stopped her mid-motion, informing her that the spoliation of evidence during a federal investigation carried its own heavy weight of years. The truth, much like the black ink on that mahogany desk, was now permanent. The transition from the estate to the police transport was a cinematic study in the fall of a dynasty. I stood by the SUV, my breath forming pale clouds in the crisp morning air, and watched as Gertrude and Fritz were led out in handcuffs. They were still wearing their expensive silk robes, symbols of the luxury I had provided, now a jarring contrast to the cold, galvanized steel cinched around their wrists. Seeing them like that, stripped of their veneer of respectability, didn't bring me the joy I might have expected. It brought a profound, clinical clarity. I realized that my parents were not monsters from a fairy tale. They were simply small, greedy people who had forgotten that the foundation of a home is love, not leverage. As Gertrude was led past our vehicle, her eyes locked onto mine, and the silence was shattered by a final, desperate verbal explosion. She screamed at me, her voice a jagged rasp of traitor and ungrateful child. She galled at the air, unable to comprehend that Christabel, the youngest, the one she had designated as the family's resource, had finally set a boundary that couldn't be crossed. Her rage was a mirror of her own failure. I didn't shout back. I didn't need the last word to win. I simply stepped out of the car, looking her in the eyes with a stoic compassion that seemed to infuriate her more than any insult could. "I am not punishing you, Mother," I said, my voice steady and carrying across the snowy driveway. "I am simply letting you live in the world you spent all night creating. Forgiveness is a quiet grace I carry for my own peace, but it is not a hall pass for your cruelty." I saw the confusion in her eyes, the inability to understand that freedom is a heavy burden when you use it to harm the people who love you. I felt a deep, quiet sadness for the ghost of the family I had tried so hard to save. I handed a small manila envelope to the lead investigator. It contained the original titles to the house. "The house is theirs," I told the agent. "It was built on my sweat, but it's fueled by their greed. They can keep the walls. I'm taking my life back." I climbed back into the SUV, where Lyle was waiting, his hand reaching over to squeeze mine. In the back seat, John Bonet was safe, her small chest rising and falling in the deep, untroubled sleep of the innocent. She would wake up in Manhattan, far away from the rot of this night. I pulled out my phone and performed a final, Digital cleanse. I deleted the family group chat, blocked every contact associated with the Greenwich estate, and deactivated the secondary credit cards Casey had been bleeding dry. One by one, I severed the tethers. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of survival. As Lyle shifted the vehicle into gear and we merged onto the I-95 South, I watched the sunrise over the Atlantic. The orange and gold lights spilled across the horizon, untainted by the shadows we were leaving behind. Sometimes, the only way to save a garden is to walk away from the weeds and let the winter take them. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had carried since I was old enough to realize I was the least in my mother's eyes. Looking at the sleeping child in the mirror, I realized my greatest achievement wasn't the firm or the penthouse. It was the strength to ensure the next generation would never know the cost of a blood debt. I smiled at Lyle, my eyes sparkling with the joy of a new day. I wasn't thinking about lost assets or the legal battles ahead. I was thinking about the quiet lunch we'd enjoy together in the city, John Bonet's laughter, and the simple, profound joy of single life. I realized that being the smallest no longer meant having the quietest voice in the room. It meant having the courage to close the old chapter and begin a completely new one.